Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world before wands, before spells, before the soft crackle of enchanted fire in a stone hearth. Imagine a world where magic existed, but had no name, no framework, no tradition. It was simply there, woven into certain people the way breath is woven into the body. Not a skill, not a craft, just a presence. This is where our story begins. Long before Hogwarts stood on its windswept Scottish hillside, long before the first broomstick lifted off the ground, long before anyone had carved a wand from a branch of elder, or holly, or vine, there were witches and wizards living quietly among ordinary people. They did not yet call themselves witches and wizards. They had no collective name at all. They were simply different. And in a world that did not understand difference, that was a dangerous thing to be. The earliest magical humans likely did not understand the source of their abilities. A child might have caused the flowers in a garden to bloom in midwinter without touching them. A grieving woman might have made the rain fall only over her house, as if the sky itself was weeping with her. An angry young man might have caused a fire to leap from a hearth, across a room in the direction of whoever had wronged him. These were not acts of deliberate magic. They were accidents, emotional surges that broke through some invisible membrane between intention and reality. We call this phenomenon in modern magical scholarship the undifferentiated magical response. It is the raw form of magic that still exists today in young witches and wizards before they receive formal training. Every student who arrives at Hogwarts for the first time has done something of this kind. A levitated toy in a moment of excitement, a vanished food from a plate they did not want to eat, a small animal that appeared, confused and trembling from nowhere at all. But in the ancient world there was no Hogwarts to explain it. No owls delivered letters of reassurance. No kindly professor arrived at the door to tell a frightened family that everything was going to be all right. Magic was simply happening, and no one understood why. Let the thought of that ancient world settle over you as you relax your body. Feel the weight of history. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. We have a very long and very beautiful story to tell tonight, and there is no need to rush it. The question of where magical ability first came from is one that has occupied wizarding scholars for centuries. The answer, like most things in the magical world, is complicated and not entirely settled. The prevailing theory among modern magical anthropologists is that magical ability is a genetic trait, though it does not follow the same inheritance patterns as most physical characteristics. It can appear in families with long histories of magic, but it can also appear spontaneously in families with no magical ancestry at all. These unexpected magical children are called Muggleborns, and they represent one of the most fascinating puzzles in wizarding biology. The ancient wizarding world had its own explanations. Many early magical communities believed that their power came from divine sources, that certain gods or spirits had breathed special fire into their ancestors, or that their bloodlines carried a gift from nature itself. The precise mythology varied from culture to culture, but the essential idea was consistent. Magic was a blessing, and those who possessed it were chosen. This belief had both beautiful and troubling consequences. On one hand, it gave early magical communities a sense of identity and purpose. They were custodians of something rare and sacred. They had responsibilities that ordinary people did not. Many early wizarding traditions included elaborate rituals of thanksgiving, ceremonies performed under the full moon or at the turning of seasons, designed to honour the source of their power and ensure it continued to flow. On the other hand, the belief that magic was a mark of divine favour could tip easily into arrogance. If your power came from the gods, what did that make you in relation to the people who had no power? Superior, separate, untouchable? These are questions that the wizarding world has never fully resolved, and they echo down through every chapter of the history we are about to explore. But in the very earliest period, before those questions had fully crystallized, magical humans and non-magical humans lived in much closer proximity than they would in later centuries. The division between the two communities was not yet a wall. It was more like a fog. You could see through it, even if only partially, and on both sides people were curious about what lay beyond. Allow yourself to drift into that ancient fog now. Feel it soft and cool around you. The world is old and patient and full of things not yet named. The earliest form of magic that humans practiced, was what scholars now call wild magic. This was magic performed without tools, without words, without any formal system of thought or technique. It was magic in its most natural and most unpredictable state. Wild magic was governed almost entirely by emotion. Strong feelings created strong magical effects. A burst of joy might cause a meadow to erupt in sudden bloom. An episode of terror might cause a person to become temporarily invisible. Rage could shatter stone. Grief could call down rain. This emotional sensitivity made early magical humans both extraordinary and unstable. They were capable of remarkable things, but those things were not always under their control. A child who woke from a nightmare might inadvertently demolish a wall. A young person falling in love for the first time might cause every candle in a village to ignite simultaneously. Magic, without discipline, was as likely to cause harm as to help. The first attempts to control this wild power came in two forms. The first form was ritual. Early magical communities began to notice that certain actions, performed in certain ways, at certain times, seemed to produce more reliable results. Lighting a fire while speaking specific words seemed to make the fire burn hotter and longer than a fire lit in silence. Gathering specific plants at dawn produced medicines that healed wounds faster than plants gathered at other times. Tracing specific patterns in the earth before planting seemed to make crops grow more abundantly. These observations accumulated over generations into bodies of traditional knowledge. Some of the oldest wizarding families still possess fragments of these early ritual systems, though in many cases the original meaning has been lost and only the form remains. The second form of control was meditation. Certain individuals discovered that by deliberately calming their emotions, they could achieve a kind of inner stillness from which magic could be directed with greater precision. This was an early precursor to the mental disciplines that are now taught as part of advanced magical training. The occlumency and legilimency traditions both trace distant roots to these ancient meditative practices, as does the theory of non-verbal spellcasting. Neither of these approaches produced anything like the precision of modern wand-based magic. But they represented the first crucial insight. Magic was not just something that happened to you. It was something you could, with effort and patience, learn to shape. Let that idea settle into you as you breathe slowly. The idea that even the most overwhelming force can be shaped. That wildness can become craft. That chaos can become art. The history of magic is not a single story. It is many stories, told simultaneously in different corners of the world, in different languages, with different tools and different philosophies, and some of the oldest and most sophisticated of these stories come from the ancient East. In the magical communities of what is now the Middle East and Central Asia, some of the earliest systematic approaches to magical practice developed. Scholars in these traditions were among the first to attempt to categorize magical phenomena, to identify patterns in the behavior of magic, and to develop theoretical frameworks for understanding why certain practices worked and others did not. The tradition of wandless magic, which remains highly developed in parts of Africa and the Middle East to this day, has its roots in these ancient communities. Practitioners in these traditions argued that the wand, which was primarily a European and East Asian innovation, created a kind of dependency in its users. That by channeling magic through a single external object, witches and wizards were actually limiting their access to the full breadth of their power. This is a debate that still continues in certain academic circles within the wizarding world. The practitioners of Wagadu, the great African wizarding school located in Uganda, are among the most accomplished wandless magical practitioners in the world, and their tradition of hand magic, performing spells through deliberate gesture rather than through a wand, represents one of the oldest continuous magical traditions still in active practice. In ancient Mesopotamia, magical practitioners developed some of the earliest known written records of magical theory. Clay tablets inscribed with what appear to be incantation instructions have been recovered from sites in what is now Iraq, and while many of these texts remain incompletely understood, they suggest a sophisticated system of categorized magic that predates any comparable European tradition by several thousand years. These ancient practitioners appeared to organize magic into domains: magic associated with the natural world, magic associated with healing and harm, magic associated with the dead, and magic associated with the divine. Each domain had its own specialists, its own rituals, and its own ethical codes. The concept of magical specialization, which we see reflected today in the existence of distinct magical careers like auras, healers, and curse breakers, may have very deep roots in these ancient domain structures. Let yourself imagine those ancient practitioners now. Working by firelight, pressing their fingers into wet clay, trying to capture in words the flickering, extraordinary thing they had discovered they could do. They did not know that what they were writing would echo across millennia. They were simply trying to understand, simply trying to organize the beautiful chaos that lived inside them. That effort, that reaching toward understanding, is something you share with them across every century that has passed. Perhaps no ancient civilization is more deeply intertwined with the history of magic in the popular imagination than ancient Egypt. And in this case, the imagination is not entirely wrong. Ancient Egypt was home to one of the most developed and richly documented magical traditions of the ancient world. The word that the Egyptians used for magic, Heka, was also the name of a god, the deity who personified magical power. This tells us something important about how the Egyptians understood magic. It was not separate from the divine. It was divine. To practice magic was to work with a force that existed at the very foundation of the universe. Heka, the concept and the practice, permeated Egyptian culture at every level. It was used in medicine, in religious ceremony, in protection against evil forces, and in governance. The pharaoh himself was understood to be a magical being, a living conduit between the human world and the divine world, and his ability to maintain the cosmic order of Egypt was understood as fundamentally magical in nature. In wizarding historical scholarship, Egypt is recognized as one of the earliest centers of advanced magical civilization. The construction of the pyramids, while partially accomplished through ordinary human labor, involved magical engineering techniques that have never been fully replicated. The precise alignment of the Great Pyramid complex at Giza with stellar constellations is believed by many wizarding archaeologists to reflect not just sophisticated astronomical knowledge, but active use of celestial magic, spells and rituals calibrated to the positions of specific stars and planets. The tradition of tomb magic in ancient Egypt was particularly sophisticated. The Egyptians believed that the dead continued to exist in another realm, and that the proper performance of magical rites could ensure a safe and comfortable existence in that realm. The spells inscribed on tomb walls and in the so-called Book of the Dead are among the earliest examples of fixed-form verbal magic, spells that required specific words spoken in specific sequences to produce their intended effect. This principle, that magic could be reliably reproduced by speaking specific words in a specific order, is the philosophical foundation on which all modern verbal spellcasting is built. Egyptian magical practitioners also developed early versions of several practices that remain in use in the modern wizarding world. Their use of amulets and protective objects anticipates the modern practice of object enchantment. Their medically oriented magic, combining herbal knowledge with ritual incantation, prefigures the work of wizarding healers. And their extensive tradition of divination, reading signs in the stars, in the behavior of animals, in the shapes of smoke and water, contributed fundamentally to the development of the divination discipline as it is now taught at schools like Hogwarts. The ancient Egyptian magical community was large and well organized, with a formal hierarchy of practitioners ranging from village-level healers and charm workers to the great temple priests who performed the most powerful and consequential rituals of state. It was not, to use modern terminology, a hidden community. Magic was public, acknowledged, and central to the functioning of Egyptian society. The retreat of magic from public life, the gradual withdrawal of the wizarding world behind the veil of secrecy, was a much later development. In the age of the pharaohs, magic was something the whole world could see. Breathe that in slowly. A world in which magic was not secret, not shameful, not hidden. A world in which it stood in the sunlight, enormous and magnificent, for everyone to witness. We must now move forward across many centuries, crossing the ancient world and arriving at a particular time and a particular place that will be more familiar to you. Britain, approximately 1,000 years ago. To understand the founding of Hogwarts, you must first understand the world in which it was founded, and that world was very different from the one we inhabit today. Britain in the early medieval period was a fractured and often violent place. The old Roman order had long since collapsed. Viking raids had reshaped coastal communities. The kingdoms of what would eventually become England, Scotland and Wales were in constant flux, their borders redrawn by war and alliance and marriage and death. Christianity had taken hold as the dominant religion, and with it had come a new and powerful institution, the Church, with its own views about things like magic. For the wizarding community of Britain in this period, the tension with the non-magical world was growing. The Church's increasingly hostile position toward practices it classified as witchcraft created a dangerous atmosphere. Witch trials, though they would reach their most extreme form several centuries later, were already occurring. The line between reverence for magic and fear of it was shifting, and it was shifting in a direction that was bad for witches and wizards. It was into this environment that 4 of the most brilliant witches and wizards of their generation were born: Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, Salazar Slytherin. We do not know with certainty where each of them came from. The historical record for this period is fragmentary, relying heavily on oral tradition, later chronicles of uncertain accuracy, and the occasional enchanted artifact that has survived across the centuries. But from what we can piece together, they came from different parts of Britain, had different personalities and different areas of magical expertise, and shared one thing above all others: a belief that the proper teaching of magic was both possible and urgently necessary. Before the founding of Hogwarts, magical education in Britain was largely informal. Magical children learned from their parents if their parents were magical, or they received private tuition if their families were prosperous enough to arrange it. Those with no magical family and no access to a tutor simply struggled as best they could, learning through trial and error, often with dangerous results. The 4 founders envisioned something different: a school, a place where magical children from any background could come to learn, safely, systematically, under the guidance of skilled teachers, within walls specifically designed and enchanted to support the work of magical education. It was a revolutionary idea, and like all revolutionary ideas, it was also in certain respects a deeply complicated one. Of the 4 founders, Godric Gryffindor is perhaps the one about whom the most is known, largely because of the enduring mythology that has grown up around him in the 10 centuries since his death. Gryffindor is believed to have come from the English countryside, possibly from a village in the west of England, though the precise location has never been definitively established. He was, by all accounts, a physically imposing man, tall and strong-built, with a warrior's bearing that he never entirely put aside even in old age. He was a skilled duelist, and the tradition of dueling as a regulated form of magical combat has roots in the practices that Gryffindor himself helped to codify and teach. But to think of Gryffindor primarily as a warrior is to misunderstand him. He was, at his core, an idealist. His particular passion was the question of who deserved to be taught magic. In the wizarding world of his time, the answer most people gave to that question was simple: people who came from magical families. Blood mattered. Heritage mattered. The idea that magical power could appear in the child of ordinary non-magical parents, and that such a child might deserve the same education as a child from a centuries-old wizarding family, was not widely accepted. Gryffindor rejected this view entirely. He believed that what mattered was not where a student came from, but what they were capable of, and more specifically, what they were willing to dare. His criterion for students worthy of Hogwarts was courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. This was not merely an abstract philosophy. It had practical implications for who was admitted to Hogwarts in its earliest years. Under Gryffindor's influence, the school from its very beginning accepted students from Muggle families, students who had no wizarding heritage at all, but who possessed magical ability and the courage to develop it. This policy would eventually contribute, at least in part, to the conflict that drove Salazar Slytherin from the school. But we will come to that in its proper time. Gryffindor's most famous artifact is his sword, a ruby-hilted weapon of goblin-forged silver that bears his name. The sword possesses a remarkable property. It will appear to any true Gryffindor in a moment of real need, presenting itself as an instrument of the courage that Gryffindor valued above all else. The sword has appeared at several critical moments in the modern history of Hogwarts, and in each case its appearance has carried with it the weight of everything Gryffindor stood for. He valued bravery, he valued daring, he valued nerve. And he valued chivalry, the code of conduct that he believed should govern how the brave treated those who were less powerful than themselves, If Gryffindor was the warrior of the four founders, Helga Hufflepuff was the builder. Not in the physical sense, though she contributed substantially to the magical construction of Hogwarts itself. But in a deeper sense, she was the one who built the human infrastructure of the school, the systems and traditions that made it possible for a diverse and sometimes fractious community to live and work together. Hufflepuff is believed to have come from Wales, and her Welsh heritage may be reflected in her deep connection to the land and to the natural world. She was a gifted food magician, one of the only branches of magic that remains to this day the subject of certain absolute restrictions. The creation of good food through magic is extremely difficult, and some aspects of it remain entirely impossible. Hufflepuff was one of the few practitioners in history who came close to mastering the full range of what food magic could accomplish, and her recipes and magical techniques formed the foundation of Hogwarts kitchen practice for centuries. But her most significant contribution to Hogwarts was not technical, it was philosophical. Hufflepuff believed, with a depth of conviction that distinguished her even among the founders, that every student deserved the chance to learn. Not just the brave like Gryffindor's students, not just the brilliant like Ravenclaw's. Not just the ambitious like Slytherin's, every student, without exception. Her criterion for the students she chose for her house was not a particular talent or quality, but a disposition, hard work, patience, loyalty, and a willingness to treat every person encountered with fairness and decency. These qualities may sound less dramatic than Gryffindor's courage or Ravenclaw's wit. They do not lend themselves to the same kind of legendary narratives. There are no famous swords associated with Hufflepuff, no tales of spectacular duels or breathtaking intellectual breakthroughs. But within the school itself, Hufflepuff's values were arguably the most essential of all, because they were the values that held the community together. Hufflepuff negotiated disputes between the other founders. She developed the systems by which students from very different backgrounds learned to share spaces, meals, study time, and eventually friendship. She created the traditions of communal eating that persist at Hogwarts to this day. The long tables where students of different houses and different backgrounds sit together, the enormous shared feasts that mark the turning points of the school year. She understood something that the others sometimes forgot, that magic is only as powerful as the human relationships that surround it. That knowledge, however extraordinary, withers in isolation. That community is not a luxury. It is a necessity. Her magical artifact, a golden cup with badger handles, is one of the most beautiful objects ever produced in the British wizarding world. It was said to possess extraordinary healing properties and to hold water from a spring with magical restorative powers. The cup's history across the centuries after Hufflepuff's death was tragically troubled, but the values it represented endured. Rowena Ravenclaw is in many ways the most mysterious of the four founders. She left fewer direct traces in the popular mythology of the wizarding world than Gryffindor, and her personal history is less richly documented than Hufflepuff's. What we know of her comes primarily from the artifacts she left behind, the traditions of scholarship she established, and the one devastating personal story that has become part of Hogwarts legend. Ravenclaw is believed to have come from the Scottish Highlands, though some traditions place her ancestry in a more easterly part of Britain. She was, by universal account, the most intellectually gifted of the four founders. Her theoretical understanding of magic was unmatched, and her ability to devise new spells and magical techniques from first principles, reasoning from basic magical laws toward novel applications, was extraordinary even by the standards of an era that produced several other magical geniuses. She founded her house on the principle of wit, wisdom, and learning. And she selected students distinguished not by a particular personality type but by a quality of mind, the capacity for original thought, for seeing connections that others missed, for asking questions that went deeper than the obvious surface of things. Ravenclaw is responsible for several of the most significant innovations in the magical infrastructure of Hogwarts. The enchanted staircases, whose movements are governed by a logic that still resists complete analysis, are attributed to her design. The enchantment on the ceiling of the Great Hall, which reflects the true sky outside with an accuracy that no simple mimicry spell could explain, is also said to be her work. And the ever-shifting layout of certain corridors and rooms, which ensures that the school always feels slightly larger than it is, and always seems to have one more secret to reveal, is a direct expression of Ravenclaw's philosophy that an environment designed to teach should itself be a puzzle worth solving. Her most famous artifact is her diadem, a crown of bronze engraved with the motto, "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." The diadem was reputed to enhance the wisdom of its wearer, to clarify thought and sharpen perception in ways that would help even an already brilliant mind reach insights it could not otherwise achieve. The tragic story of Ravenclaw's personal life involves her daughter, a young woman known as Helena, who stole the diadem and fled with it to Albania. Ravenclaw is said to have died of grief following her daughter's disappearance, choosing not to pursue her and not to reveal the theft, hoping that Helena would eventually return on her own. She never did. And the story of that diadem's long, painful journey through the centuries is one of the darker threads woven into the fabric of Hogwarts history. But let us not dwell in the darkness yet. Let us rest for a moment in the light that Ravenclaw brought into the world. The light of genuine intellectual curiosity, the pleasure of a hard problem turned over and over in the mind until it finally gives way and reveals its secret, the satisfaction of understanding something, truly understanding it, from the inside out. That is Ravenclaw's gift, and it lives on in every student who has ever climbed to that high tower, looked out over the hills, and felt their mind open like a window onto something enormous. And now we must come to the most complicated of the four founders, the one whose legacy has been most argued over, most distorted, and most difficult to assess fairly across the centuries that have passed since his death: Salazar Slytherin. Let us begin with what is not disputed. Slytherin was a magical genius of the First Order. His technical skill in magic, particularly in the areas of Parseltongue and serpent-related magic, was extraordinary. His understanding of magical architecture contributed significantly to the most secure and complex parts of Hogwarts. The Chamber of Secrets, which he built beneath the school, is a feat of magical engineering that has never been fully understood even by those who have managed to enter it, as the school's enchantments have resisted all subsequent attempts to fully survey or map it. He was cunning in the classical sense, not merely clever, but strategically intelligent, capable of seeing long-range consequences and planning accordingly. He had an intuitive understanding of how power worked, both magical power and social and political power, and he used that understanding with great precision. His criterion for selecting students for his house reflected his values: ambition, cunning, resourcefulness, and the drive to achieve greatness. These are not intrinsically negative qualities. They are the qualities of leaders, of innovators, of the people who shape the future rather than simply living in it. But Slytherin also held a view that set him fundamentally apart from Gryffindor, and eventually tore the founding partnership apart. He believed that magic should be taught only to students of pure magical heritage. That the children of Muggle parents, however magically talented, were unworthy of the education that Hogwarts offered. That allowing them in would weaken the wizarding tradition, dilute its power, and expose the magical community to dangers that could not be managed if the boundary between the magical and non-magical worlds was not kept absolutely clear. It is important to try to understand this position in its historical context before condemning it entirely. The wizarding world in this period faced genuine existential threats from the non-magical population. Witch trials were occurring. There was real violence. The danger of exposure was not abstract. Slytherin's concern about what would happen if too many people with connections to the Muggle world were brought inside the magical community may have been rooted, at least in part, in genuine fear rather than pure contempt. But the position itself, whatever its psychological roots, was one that Gryffindor in particular could not accept. The two founders clashed repeatedly over this question, and the clashes grew increasingly bitter. Eventually, according to the most reliable historical accounts, Slytherin left Hogwarts. Some accounts say he was driven out by the other three, others say he chose to leave rather than continue to be overruled. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Before he left, Slytherin built the Chamber of Secrets. He sealed within it a basilisk, a creature of enormous and terrible power, with instructions that it would one day be released by his true heir to purge the school of all those he considered unworthy to study there, that chamber. And the creature within it waited in the dark for nearly 1,000 years. Let that sit with you quietly, the idea that a wound, if left unaddressed, does not simply heal on its own, that it waits, that history is not always linear progress, but sometimes a slow accumulation of unresolved conflict, waiting for someone to finally face it. We have been moving through history at a considerable pace, and now we need to slow down and examine one of the most important technological developments in the entire history of magic, the invention of the wand. Wands did not always exist. This is a fact that many witches and wizards, raised in a tradition where the wand is central to nearly all magical practice, find genuinely difficult to absorb. But the wand is an invention, a tool, developed at a specific point in magical history and refined over centuries of experimentation and observation. The earliest magical practitioners, as we discussed earlier, worked with wild magic. No tools, no focus objects, just the power of their own emotion and will direct it outward. As magical practice became more organized and more theoretical, practitioners began to experiment with various objects as focus points, something to hold that might help the mind concentrate the direction of a spell or the shape of an effect. Early magical practitioners experimented with a wide range of materials: stones, bones, crystals, metals, shells. Many of these objects had properties that made them useful in specific magical contexts. Certain crystals appear to amplify magical effects. Certain metals seem to stabilize magical energy. But none of them produced the dramatic improvement in precision and power that came with the discovery of wood. The reason that wood became the dominant wand material, and the reason that wands made from wood remain the gold standard of magical focus objects to this day, comes down to one fundamental fact. Wood is alive, or rather it was alive, and the magical properties of a tree do not entirely disappear when the tree is cut. They become concentrated, preserved in the wood, in a form that interacts with the magical energy of a human practitioner, in a uniquely powerful and precise way. Different woods have different magical properties, different affinities, different strengths and weaknesses. A wand of holly has a particular relationship with lunar magic, and with practitioners who are navigating a life marked by danger and change. A wand of elder is the most powerful of all wand woods, but also the most dangerous to its owner. A wand of vine tends to choose practitioners with hidden depths, people whose outer life does not fully reflect the richness of their inner world. The matching of a specific wood to a specific practitioner, which is now the central practice of wand making, appears to have developed gradually over centuries of accumulated observation. Early wand makers worked empirically. They made wands from whatever wood was available, noticed which practitioners seemed to do best with which types of wood, and over generations refined their understanding into something approaching a science. But wood alone was not enough to make the modern wand. The most significant breakthrough in wand technology was the discovery that incorporating a magical substance into the core of the wand, a material sourced from a magical creature, dramatically increased the wand's responsiveness and power. The 3 wand cores that are now considered the most prestigious, the cores used by Garrick Ollivander and his predecessors in the finest wand-making tradition, are the tail feather of a phoenix, the heartstring of a dragon, and the core fibre of a unicorn hare. Each of these cores produces a different quality of magic and tends to choose a different type of practitioner. Phoenix feather cores are the rarest and the most independent, capable of the greatest range of magic but sometimes resistant to the will of their owners. Dragon heartstring cores tend to produce wands of raw power, quick to learn new spells and loyal to their current owner while that ownership holds. Unicorn hare cores produce the most consistent and faithful magic, less prone to dark magic than the others, most reliably true to their owner. The combination of the right wood and the right core, matched precisely to a specific witch or wizard, produces what wand makers describe as a true pairing. And in a true pairing, the wand does not merely transmit the practitioner's magic, it partners with it, amplifying it, refining it, and in some cases gently guiding it toward ends that the practitioner had not fully articulated even in their own mind. The wand, in other words, is not just a tool, it is in some meaningful sense a collaborator. The history of magic cannot be told without telling the history of the non-human magical peoples who have contributed to it, and of those peoples the goblins have made contributions so significant and so foundational to the modern magical world that their story deserves its own chapter. Goblins are among the most ancient of the thinking beings that populate the magical world. Their civilization predates the organized wizarding community by an enormous margin, and their magical and technological achievements in that long history are extraordinary. The most obvious of these achievements is goblin metalwork. Goblin-made objects are distinguished by a property that no human craftsperson has ever been able to replicate. They are created through a process that fuses magical energy directly into the material of the object at a molecular level. This is fundamentally different from how human wizards enchant objects. When a human witch or wizard enchants an object, they apply spells to it from the outside. The enchantment sits on the surface of the material, however deeply applied. It can be reversed, countered, or allowed to fade. Goblin metalwork does not work this way. The magic is part of the metal itself, as inseparable from it as the properties of the material are from its composition. A goblin-made sword does not merely have magical properties because spells were applied to it. It has magical properties because the goblins who made it understood how to work with the magical nature of the material at a level that human practitioners have never accessed. The practical consequences of this are remarkable. Goblin-made objects that are used for a purpose appropriate to their design absorb magical properties from their use. Godric Gryffindor's sword, for example, is goblin-made, and over the centuries it has absorbed into its blade any substance that a true Gryffindor has driven the sword into in an act of courage. Basilisk venom. Other magical substances of great power. These substances have become part of the sword itself, making it capable of destroying objects that ordinary weapons could never touch. But the history of goblins and wizards is not a harmonious one. The relationship between the two communities has been defined by centuries of conflict, misunderstanding, and profound disagreements about fundamental questions, most critically the question of who owns a magical object. For goblins, the maker of an object retains a permanent spiritual and legal connection to it. A goblin-made sword belongs to the goblin clan that made it, regardless of who paid for it, regardless of how many generations it has been in a particular wizarding family, regardless of what is written in a human contract or will. When the current possessor dies, the object should, in goblin law, return to its maker. For wizards, an object purchased is an object owned. Property passes from owner to owner by sale and inheritance. The maker's connection to it ends at the moment of the transaction. This fundamental disagreement has been the source of repeated goblin rebellions throughout wizarding history. Wizards who refused to return goblin-made objects at the death of their owners were, from the goblin perspective, engaging in a form of theft. The ongoing theft of objects that legally and morally should have been returned. And from the goblin perspective, this was not a minor grievance. It was the systematic despoilment of their cultural heritage, the gradual transfer of their finest work out of their own community and into the hands of people who did not even fully understand what they possessed. The Goblin rebellions of the 17th and 18th centuries were among the most violent conflicts in modern wizarding history. They were eventually suppressed, but never truly resolved. The underlying disagreement about ownership remains unaddressed, and it continues to generate tension between the two communities to this day. Let this sit in your mind as you breathe slowly, the reminder that every extraordinary object in the magical world has a history, that beauty and craftsmanship carry weight, that the story of who made something and under what circumstances is never entirely separate from the story of the thing itself. Among all the disciplines of magic practiced in the modern wizarding world, potions has perhaps the longest and most continuous history. The tradition of using plants, minerals, animal products, and other natural substances in combination with magical techniques to produce extraordinary effects is as old as organized human civilization. Every culture that has ever possessed magical practitioners has also possessed some tradition of what we might broadly call potions. The precise techniques vary enormously. The theoretical frameworks used to explain why certain combinations work and others do not have been contested across centuries of academic debate. But the basic practice, the careful combination of magical ingredients to produce a substance with properties that transcend the ordinary capabilities of its components, is universal. The earliest known potions traditions appear to be contemporaneous with the earliest written magical records in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text dating to approximately 1500 years before the Common Era, contains descriptions of preparations that, while recorded in the context of mundane medicine, bear strong resemblance to early potions recipes when examined through a magical lens. Several of the ingredients specified are magical substances whose non-magical uses are insignificant, but whose magical applications are profound. The great theoretical breakthrough in potions came not from any single individual, but from a tradition of accumulated observation and experiment. Potions practitioners across centuries noticed certain patterns. They noticed that the order in which ingredients are added matters, that temperature matters, that the quality of the water used as a base matters in ways that seem to exceed any mundane chemical explanation. That stirring direction, clockwise or counterclockwise, produces different effects even when all other variables are held constant. These observations could not be fully explained by mundane chemistry or biology. They required a magical theoretical framework, a way of thinking about ingredients not just as chemical substances, but as magical entities with their own inherent properties and their own ways of interacting with other magical entities. The development of this framework, which underpins the teaching of potions at schools like Hogwarts today, was one of the great intellectual achievements of the medieval wizarding world. The key insight was that magical ingredients are not passive. They are, in some meaningful sense, active. A bezoar stone placed in a potion does not merely neutralize poisons through some automatic chemical process. The stone, which has its own magical properties developed through the particular conditions of its formation in a goat's stomach, actively interacts with magical toxins in a way that requires an understanding of the magical nature of both the stone and the toxin. This active model of potions, which replaced an earlier passive model in which ingredients were thought of purely as sources of chemical compounds, transformed the discipline. It opened up the possibility of designing new potions from theoretical principles rather than purely through trial and error, and it laid the groundwork for some of the most remarkable potions achievements in wizarding history. Among the most significant of these achievements is the development of Polyjuice Potion, which allows one person to take on the complete physical appearance of another for a limited period. This is a potion that requires months of preparation, 17 ingredients, and an extremely precise sequence of steps. It was first successfully brewed in the 14th century and represents one of the most complex feats of magical biochemistry ever achieved. The Draught of Living Death, a potion that produces a sleep so deep that it is indistinguishable from death, has roots in much older sleep magic traditions. The Felix Felicis, known colloquially as liquid luck, which grants its drinker a period of extraordinary good fortune, was developed in the 16th century after centuries of failed attempts, and is still considered one of the most difficult and dangerous potions to brew correctly, prone to causing serious side effects if the proportions are even slightly off. And the love potion tradition, which produces powerful infatuations in its recipients, is among the oldest in potions history, and also among the most ethically fraught. The use of love potions without consent is considered a serious magical offence in most wizarding jurisdictions, and for good reason. The state they produce is not love at all, but a kind of magical compulsion that strips its victim of genuine choice. The distinction between manufactured infatuation and authentic feeling is one that the wizarding legal and ethical tradition has consistently maintained, however imperfectly in practice. Of all the disciplines of magic studied in the modern wizarding world, none is more controversial and none more ancient than divination. The basic claim of divination is extraordinary, that the future, which has not yet happened, can nonetheless be perceived in the present, that within certain materials, certain patterns, certain states of consciousness, the shape of what is coming is already written in a language that the skilled practitioner can learn to read. This claim has been debated with great ferocity throughout the history of the wizarding world. On one side are the practitioners themselves and the theoretical tradition they represent, which argues that time is not purely linear, that the connections between cause and effect create patterns that extend both forward and backward through time, and that certain magical gifts allow some individuals to perceive those patterns with an accuracy that cannot be attributed to chance. On the other side are the skeptics, many of them working in more precise disciplines like transfiguration or charms, who point out that the claimed successes of divination practitioners are poorly documented, that prediction is subject to confirmation bias, that ambiguous prophecies can be interpreted retrospectively to match any outcome, and that the discipline's theoretical foundations remain entirely unverified by any rigorous method. The truth, as is often the case, appears to be more complex than either side of this argument acknowledges. True seers, Individuals with genuine prophetic ability do exist. The evidence for this is not merely anecdotal. The existence of the Hall of Prophecy in the Department of Mysteries at the Ministry of Magic, which housed thousands of genuine prophecies captured in glowing glass orbs, represents a form of institutional acknowledgement that genuine prophetic ability is real. Prophecies stored there had been independently verified over centuries, their predictions checked against outcomes, and the correlation was far beyond what probability could explain. But true seers are extremely rare, and the vast majority of what passes for divination in everyday wizarding practice, the reading of tea leaves, the interpretation of crystal balls, the examination of palms and star charts, does not reliably produce genuine prophetic insight. It produces at best a framework for thinking about future possibilities. At worst, it produces confident predictions that mislead their recipients into choices they would not otherwise have made. The most famous genuine prophecy in modern wizarding history is the one made by Professor Sybil Trelawney in the winter of 1980, recorded in the presence of Albus Dumbledore at the Hogshead Inn in Hogsmeade. This prophecy concerned the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord, and it set in motion a chain of events whose consequences are still being felt in the wizarding world today. The mechanism by which this prophecy was made, Trelawney entering an involuntary trance and speaking in a voice that was not her own, is characteristic of the rarest and most powerful form of prophetic experience. In these moments, the seer is not reasoning about the future. They are, in some sense that remains poorly understood even by the best magical theorists, channeling it. They are a vessel through which something passes, something that comes from beyond the normal boundaries of time. What that something is, and how it works, is one of the deepest unsolved mysteries in the entire magical world. We cannot complete this survey of the development of magical knowledge without addressing the part of that knowledge that the wizarding world has deemed too dangerous, too corrupting, or too morally destructive to be taught freely. The dark arts are not a recent invention. They are not a deviation from some pure and innocent original form of magic. They are as old as magic itself, because they grow from the same soil as all other magic, the human desire to affect the world, combined with the capacity to do so. What distinguishes the dark arts from other branches of magical practice is not primarily their power, though some forms of dark magic are certainly among the most powerful spells known. What distinguishes them is the nature of the intent required to perform them, and the nature of the harm they do to their practitioner over time. Most magic is morally neutral in its mechanism, even if specific uses of it can be ethical or unethical. A stunning spell can be used to protect or to harm. A memory charm can be used to protect a person from dangerous knowledge or to erase their experiences without consent. The magic itself does not care. The morality lies in the intention and the context. Dark magic is different. The most powerful forms of it require not just the intention to produce a specific effect, but a particular moral orientation in the practitioner. They require something the wizarding tradition has described by various names: cruelty, the deliberate enjoyment of another's suffering, or in the most extreme cases, the willingness to destroy what should be inviolable. The unforgivable curses, classified as such by the British wizarding government in 1489, are the most extreme example of this principle. The Cruciatus curse, which inflicts unbearable pain, requires that its caster genuinely want to cause pain. A half-hearted casting, a performance of the words and motion without the underlying desire, produces a weak effect at best and nothing at worst. The curse feeds on the practitioner's cruelty, and in feeding on it, it strengthens it. The imperious curse, which subjects its victim to the complete will of its caster, requires the caster to embrace a particular form of domination, the want to control absolutely, the willingness to reduce another person to an instrument of your own will, rather than acknowledging them as a person in their own right. And the killing curse, the most terrible of the three, requires something that the wizarding tradition has rarely been willing to articulate fully, but that the deepest magical theory makes clear. It requires murder in the soul before murder in the act. It requires the practitioner to have already accepted at some fundamental level the destruction of another living being as an acceptable thing to do. The long-term effects of practicing the dark arts on the practitioner are one of the most disturbing and least discussed aspects of wizarding history. The evidence suggests clearly that repeated use of the most powerful dark magic changes the practitioner in ways that go beyond mere habit, or psychological conditioning. It damages something that magical theory has historically called the soul, a concept that is simultaneously the most ancient in the wizarding tradition and the least scientifically developed. We will return to the concept of the soul when we discuss Horcruxes, but for now let us simply sit with this understanding, that in the history of magic, as in the history of everything else, the most powerful tools available to human beings are also the most dangerous, and that the danger is not only to others but to the one who wields them. We have arrived at one of the most painful and consequential periods in the history of the wizarding world, the age of the witch trials. The persecution of people accused of witchcraft reached its most intense phase in Europe during the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. In Britain, Germany, Scandinavia and many other countries, people, mostly women but also men and children, were accused of practicing witchcraft, subjected to trials that were often prejudiced from the outset, and, upon conviction, executed in ways that were designed to be both physically painful and publicly demonstrative. The reality of this persecution is complex when examined from a wizarding historical perspective. The vast majority of people executed as witches during this period were not in fact witches or wizards. They were ordinary people whose neighbours had accused them of something, usually motivated by fear, jealousy, property disputes, or simple misunderstanding. The tragedy of the witch trials is primarily a non-magical tragedy, the systematic murder of innocent people by frightened communities and self-serving authorities. But within this tragedy, real witches and wizards were also caught up and, in some cases, killed. The wizarding world's response to this threat was not to fight back, not to reveal themselves and defend their community, but to hide. The reasons for this choice were both pragmatic and principled. Pragmatically, even the most powerful magical community in Britain would have struggled to survive open war against the combined non-magical populations of Europe. Magically talented individuals were powerful, but they were dramatically outnumbered, and in any sustained conflict numbers eventually win. But the principled argument for hiding was arguably more important than the pragmatic one. The wizarding community recognized that the witch trials, terrible as they were not primarily about magic. They were about fear, and responding to fear with force would only deepen that fear and make the underlying problem worse rather than better. The decision to hide was formalized in the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy, signed in 1689 by the representatives of the major wizarding governments of the world. This was one of the most significant events in the history of the magical world. At a stroke, it changed the fundamental nature of wizarding civilization. Before the statute, wizards and muggles had always lived in close proximity, with varying degrees of awareness of each other. The magical community was not invisible. Its members moved in the same towns and villages as non-magical people, sometimes hiding their abilities, sometimes not. The statute changed all of this. It mandated that the entire wizarding world remove itself from muggle awareness. Magical communities were to be concealed. Magical creatures were to be hidden or managed in ways that prevented muggle observation. Memories of magical events witnessed by muggles were to be erased. The enforcement of the statute became one of the primary functions of the newly organised Ministry of Magic in Britain and its equivalents in other countries. The Obliviators, specialising in memory modification, became some of the busiest officials in wizarding government. The Muggle-Worthy Excuse Committee developed cover stories for magical accidents. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures took on responsibility for managing the magical beings and creatures that might otherwise be encountered by non-magical people. This Great Withdrawal is one of the defining events of wizarding history, and its consequences have reverberated down through every century since. The wizarding world became, in the years following the statute, increasingly separate from the non-magical world. The shared culture, the intermarriage, the casual daily interaction that had always characterized the relationship between the two communities began to fade. Wizards who had grown up in the company of muggles, who had muggle friends and family, began to find their children growing up in a world that felt entirely separate. The question of whether this separation was a tragedy or a necessity or both is one that the wizarding world has never resolved. The 20th century brought to the wizarding world a dark wizard whose philosophy and whose crimes would reshape the entire magical world and force it to confront questions about itself that it had been avoiding for centuries. Gellert Grindelwald. Grindelwald was born in the late 19th century. the product of a prestigious Central European wizarding family with deep roots in the continental magical tradition. He was educated at Durmstrang, the great Northern European wizarding school, known for its particularly rigorous approach to the dark arts and its tradition of producing graduates with an uncompromising view of magical power. Even at Durmstrang, Grindelwald was exceptional. His magical abilities were extraordinary, his theoretical understanding of magic profound, and his capacity for independent thought remarkable. He was also, even then, developing a philosophy that would eventually lead to catastrophe. The central idea of Grindelwald's philosophy was deceptively simple. Wizards were more powerful than Muggles. This was not a contested fact. The magical abilities of even an ordinary witch or wizard dramatically exceeded anything a non-magical person could do. A single competent wizard, in a direct confrontation, could incapacitate hundreds of non-magical people. From this fact, Grindelwald drew a conclusion that seemed to him to follow with logical inevitability. Wizards should rule. Not because wizards were morally superior to Muggles, not because they deserved power for any reason rooted in virtue or effort, but simply because they had it. Power was its own justification. The strong should govern, the capable should lead, and the capable in the magical world were wizards. He imagined a world in which the international statute of secrecy was abolished, in which wizards lived openly in human society, in which the two communities were not divided by secrecy, but organized by a hierarchy of power with wizards at the top. He called this vision for the greater good, a phrase that he used to justify any means necessary to achieve the end he envisioned. Grindelwald's expulsion from Durmstrang in his late teenage years did not slow his development. It accelerated it. Free of institutional constraint, he began to move through the wizarding world of continental Europe, gathering followers, building a network of like-minded individuals, and developing his plans. His time in Godric's Hollow, where he befriended a brilliant young wizard named Albus Dumbledore in the summer following his expulsion, is one of the most discussed and most debated episodes in the biography of both men. The two teenagers spent weeks in intense intellectual collaboration, exploring magical theory, debating history and philosophy, and developing what Grindelwald hoped would become the theoretical foundation of his revolution. Dumbledore was, during those weeks, partially persuaded by Grindelwald's arguments. The vision of an open wizarding world, of wizards living without secrecy, appealed to something in him. The emphasis on the greater good as the measure of all action resonated with his idealism. But the episode that ended their friendship ended it absolutely and with violence. The circumstances of the altercation at the Dumbledore house, which resulted in the death of Albus's young sister Ariana, whether by Grindelwald's hand, Albus's, or Aberforth's, were never fully clarified. But its effect on Albus Dumbledore was total and permanent. It destroyed his brief flirtation with Grindelwald's philosophy and began a lifelong struggle with guilt, with the question of his own capacity for selfishness, and with the moral weight of power. Grindelwald went on to become the most dangerous dark wizard of the early 20th century. He acquired the Elder Wand, the most powerful wand in existence, and used it to build a campaign of terror across Europe that killed thousands, created chaos in both the magical and non-magical worlds, and fundamentally destabilized the international wizarding order. His defeat came in 1945, at the hands of the one person he may have feared throughout his life, Albus Dumbledore. The duel between them is described by those who witnessed it as the greatest display of magical power and skill in living memory. Both men were operating at the absolute limit of their ability. The Elder Wand that Grindelwald wielded was the most powerful magical instrument in existence, and Dumbledore defeated him anyway, which tells you something about what kind of wizard Albus Dumbledore was. Grindelwald was imprisoned in Nurmengard, the fortress he himself had built to contain his own enemies, and he lived there until his death at the hands of Lord Voldemort decades later. If Grindelwald represents the perversion of a genuine philosophical vision into something dark and destructive, Tom Marvolo Riddle, who would become Lord Voldemort, represents something different: the transformation of personal trauma and rejection into a comprehensive ideology of death. Tom Riddle was born on the 31st of December 1926 in a Muggle orphanage in London. His mother, Merup Gaunt, was a witch of deeply degraded circumstances, the last descendant of the Slytherin line, who had used a love potion to compel a Muggle man named Tom Riddle Sr. to marry her. When she stopped giving him the potion, perhaps hoping he had come to love her genuinely, he left her. She died in the orphanage shortly after giving birth, having made no magical effort to save herself, having apparently lost the will to live. The child she left behind was, from his earliest years, frightening. Not in the way that magically powerful children are sometimes frightening, with their accidental displays of power. Tom Riddle's power was evident from a young age, but what was more disturbing than the power was the control. He did not have accidental magical episodes in the way that most children did. His magic seemed to respond to his will with a precision that should not have been possible in an untrained child. He used it deliberately, with intention, to control and to hurt other children in the orphanage. He also demonstrated, from very early on, a fundamental inability to form genuine emotional connections. The other children in the orphanage felt not love for each other, but something closer to mutual unease. They were afraid of Tom, even when they could not articulate why. And Tom, for his part, did not appear to want their love or friendship. He appeared to want their submission. When Dumbledore visited the orphanage to offer him a place at Hogwarts, Tom Riddle was 11 years old and already a person in whom something had gone profoundly, perhaps permanently, wrong. The magical world offered him what he had always craved, a community in which his power would be recognized and valued. He arrived at Hogwarts with tremendous excitement and with very specific goals. He wanted to be the best. He wanted to be exceptional. He wanted, in a way that went beyond ordinary ambition, to be permanent, unkillable, beyond the reach of the one thing he feared above all others, death. Tom Riddle's terror of death was not the ordinary human reluctance to die. It was a consuming, all-organizing obsession. The idea that he, who was so powerful and so intelligent and so extraordinary, should be subject to the same ending that claimed ordinary people was intolerable to him. He would not accept it, and almost everything he did in his life at Hogwarts and after was directed toward finding a way to escape it. His research into Horcruxes, magical objects in which a portion of the soul can be preserved, began at Hogwarts. He learned from his least favourite teacher, Professor Slughorn, the basic theory of the Horcrux in a private conversation that Slughorn spent decades trying to forget. He then pursued the research independently in the restricted section of the Hogwarts library and through contacts in the magical world outside the school, taking the theory further than it had ever been taken before. By the time Tom Riddle left Hogwarts, he had already made his first Horcrux. The process of making a Horcrux involves an act of murder, which splits the soul, and a specific dark ritual that preserves the severed portion of the soul within a chosen object. Every Horcrux he made took something from him. Not his magical power, which remained intact, but something else, something harder to define and yet unmistakably real. Voldemort ultimately created 6 Horcruxes intentionally, and 1 by accident. Each one was a piece of him, preserved against death, housed in an object of significance. The diary that had once belonged to the teenage Tom Riddle, a ring that had belonged to the Gaunt family, the ring on which he had set the resurrection stone without knowing its true significance. Slytherin's locket, which had once belonged to his ancestor. Hufflepuff's cup. Ravenclaw's diadem, which he had hidden in the room of requirement at Hogwarts, and Nagini, his snake, in whom he had placed the final deliberate portion of his soul. And then, by accident, on the night he attempted to kill an infant named Harry Potter, his rebounding curse created a 7th soul fragment, lodged, unknown to anyone including Voldemort himself, in the scar on the baby's forehead. We will come to the full story of that night shortly. But first, let us understand what the Horcrux represents in the broader history of magic. The Horcrux is the most extreme example of a category of magic that wizarding scholarship calls death magic. Spells and practices that seek to affect, alter, circumvent or transcend the ordinary magical laws governing death and the transition between life and whatever comes after. The magical world's understanding of death is more nuanced than the non-magical world's in some respects and less complete in others. Wizards know, for example, that something persists after death. The existence of ghosts, the imprinted personalities of the dead who chose to remain on the boundary between life and whatever lies beyond, is empirical evidence that death is not simple cessation. But ghosts are not the dead. They are echoes. They are, as Nearly Headless Nick once said with painful honesty, a kind of imprint in the world, not a continuation of the person who died, but a trace of them. The true self, whatever that is, goes somewhere that wizarding magic has never been able to reach or reliably describe. The three magical objects known as the Deathly Hallows, which we will discuss in the next chapter, represent three different approaches to the problem of death: mastery over it, the ability to communicate across it, and the ability to hide from it. The legend of the Hallows is ancient, older than Hogwarts, older than any organised wizarding institution in Britain, and it has fascinated and troubled the wizarding world throughout its history. But the deeper magical theory underlying all death magic begins with the soul. The soul, in magical theory, is not a metaphysical abstraction. It is a measurable, observable reality, to the extent that anything involving death is observable. The spells and actions that damage the soul produce detectable changes in the practitioner. The Horcrux process, which deliberately fractures the soul, produces changes that are evident in the practitioner's appearance, personality, and magical behaviour over time. Lord Voldemort, by the end of his Horcrux making, had so thoroughly fragmented his soul that he was barely recognisable as a human being. His physical form had become serpentine and terrible, his face a mask of bone and membrane without the ordinary contours of a human face. His emotions had narrowed to a small range of cold intensities: ambition, contempt, occasional amusement at the suffering of others, and an obsessive, almost panicked relationship with his own survival. The magical implications of a highly fragmented soul go beyond mere appearance. The spells that a greatly fragmented soul can cast are subtly different from the spells of an intact practitioner. They tend toward destruction and away from creation. They are powerful in crude, forceful ways, but weak in the delicate and creative modes that require a richness of inner life to execute. There is a reason that the most complex and beautiful magic, the most delicate charms, the most subtle transformations, the most precise potions, are rarely achieved by practitioners who have dabbled deeply in the dark arts. The same internal resources that make a person capable of cruelty also, when developed in that direction, impoverish the capacity for the particular kind of generative magic that requires love, attention, and care. This is not just an ethical observation, it is a technical one. And now we come to one of the most ancient stories in the wizarding tradition, a tale so old that no one knows with certainty whether it is legend or history, or whether, as is often the case with the most enduring stories, it is both. The tale of the three brothers. Three brothers, travelling along a road in the dark of night, came to a river too treacherous to cross. Being skilled wizards, they conjured a bridge, and on the bridge they met a figure, death itself in the form that old stories give to the thing they most wish to appease, a cloaked and ancient presence, an entity old beyond any reckoning. Death, the story says, was cheated that night, because these three brothers should have drowned in the river and they did not, and so Death pretended to congratulate them and offered each brother a gift of his choosing. The first brother, a quarrelsome man who wished for power, asked for a wand more powerful than any in existence. Death fashioned for him a wand from an elder tree standing at the riverside, a wand of extraordinary power, the Elder Wand. The second brother, an arrogant man who wished to humiliate Death further, asked for the power to call the dead back from their place. Death reached into the soil and gave him a stone with the power to bring back those who had died, the Resurrection Stone. The third brother, the humblest, the wisest, the one who understood what he was dealing with, asked for something that would allow him to leave that place without being followed. And Death, who perhaps had a small fondness for this one brother among the three, took off his own cloak of invisibility and gave it to him. The first brother took the Elder Wand, went to a distant village, and used it to kill a wizard with whom he had a quarrel. He then boasted in a tavern of his undefeatable wand. That night, another wizard, who had heard of the wand, crept into his room and slit his throat while he slept. Taking the Elder Wand for himself, Death took the first brother. The second brother returned home and used the Resurrection Stone to bring back the woman he had loved, who had died before their time. She returned, but she was not truly present. She was cold and distant, separated from him by a veil he could not cross. He grew mad with grief for what she was not and eventually killed himself to join her. Death took the second brother. The third brother hid beneath his cloak of invisibility and lived a long life, travelling far, living humbly until he was old and ready to go. And when he was, he removed the cloak and gave it to his son, and then he greeted Death as an old friend and departed with him as equals. The three objects in this tale, The Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Cloak of Invisibility are what magical tradition calls the Deathly Hallows, and unlike most legendary objects, there is compelling evidence that these three things are real. The historical identity of the three brothers in the legend is believed to correspond to three brothers named Peveril, who lived in Britain in the 13th century. The Cloak of Invisibility passed down through the Peveril family line and eventually came, through a long chain of inheritance, into the possession of the Potter family. The Resurrection Stone passed to another branch of the family and ended up, through the Gaunt line, in the possession of Voldemort, though he did not know what he had. The Elder Wand's history is a river of blood. It passed from owner to owner through death and theft and conquest for 7 centuries. The idea that possessing all 3 Deathly Hallows would make a wizard the Master of Death haunted several of the greatest magical figures of the 20th century. Both Grindelwald and Dumbledore in their young friendship dreamed of finding all 3. Voldemort sought the Elder Wand specifically, believing it would make him truly invincible, and Harry Potter became, through the extraordinary concatenation of his particular life, the only person in modern history to possess all 3. But the Master of Death, as the tale of the 3 brothers makes clear, is not a title of conquest. It is a title of acceptance. The one who mastered death was not the one who wielded the most powerful wand, not the one who brought back the dead, but the one who understood that death is not an enemy to be defeated. It is a companion to be met in the fullness of time, with open hands. The history of the Elder Wand is one of the most remarkable and most disturbing narratives in all of wizarding history. No other magical object has been at the centre of so much violence across so many centuries. The Elder Wand is described in the most reliable historical accounts as a length of elder wood, approximately 15 inches, with a thestral tail hair core. Thestral hair as a wand core is extraordinarily difficult to master, and is considered highly unstable in the hands of anyone who has not mastered death, who has not seen it directly and understood it. This characteristic of the wand's core may be part of why its history is so violent. It seeks out practitioners for whom death is a familiar companion, and those people tend to live in the parts of the world where violence occurs. The Elder Wand changes ownership when its current owner is disarmed or defeated in a duel. Killing the current owner does not necessarily transfer ownership, a fact that Voldemort fatally failed to understand. Ownership is about magical dominance, not about possession of the physical object. You can carry the wand without owning it, and you can own it without carrying it. This principle is what allowed Harry Potter to become the true master of the Elder Wand without ever touching it. When Draco Malfoy disarmed Dumbledore on the Astronomy Tower, the allegiance of the wand passed to Draco. When Harry subsequently disarmed Draco at Malfoy Manor, the allegiance passed to Harry. And when Voldemort attempted to use the Elder Wand against Harry in the final confrontation at Hogwarts, the wand would not kill its own master. The killing curse rebounded. The long history of the wand before Dumbledore acquired it in his defeat of Grindelwald in 1945 is incompletely documented, but the patterns are consistent. Each owner held it for a time, achieved extraordinary things with it, and was eventually defeated by someone who took it from them. The violence followed the wand like a shadow. Dumbledore's solution to the problem of the Elder Wand, once he had acquired it and understood what he had, is characteristic of his approach to the most dangerous things in the magical world. He planned for its power to die with him. If he died undefeated, if he arranged his own death in a way that prevented anyone from conquering him, the wand's power should have died with him. The plan nearly worked. Its failure was one of the more tragic ironies of a story full of them. After Voldemort's defeat, Harry Potter, having become the true master of the Elder Wand, chose to return it to Dumbledore's tomb. With no heir waiting to take it, no great enemy waiting to seize it, the plan was for the wand's power to die with him, as it had been intended to die with Dumbledore. Whether that plan succeeded, whether the Elder Wand truly rests quietly in that white tomb at the edge of the lake, is something that only time will tell. Of the 3 Deathly Hallows, the Resurrection Stone is the one that speaks most directly to the deepest and most universal of human experiences: grief. The loss of someone you love is a wound that does not fully close. Anyone who has experienced it knows this. The rational mind accepts the fact of death. The emotional reality of the person does not. You find yourself reaching for them in the hours after, expecting their presence in the spaces they used to occupy. hearing their voice in quiet moments when you were not guarding against it. The Resurrection Stone promises something to that grief, the power to reach across the boundary between life and whatever comes after it, and bring the dead back. The reality of what the stone actually does is more complicated and more painful than the legend suggests. It does not truly bring the dead back. It brings something, a presence, a reflection, a kind of echo of the person who died. The woman summoned by the second Peveril brother was cold, distant, there but not truly there. She suffered her presence on the living side of things. She was not restored, she was interrupted. This distinction between restoration and interruption, between genuine reunion and the creation of a painful simulacrum, is one that the wizarding world's understanding of death and the soul makes comprehensible, even if it does not make it easier to bear. The dead are, in whatever sense they still exist, somewhere that is not here. They have passed beyond the veil that is the last boundary of the magical world's knowledge. The Resurrection Stone can pull their image back across that boundary for a time, but the image is not the person. And the person, wherever they are, has to partially return to be present in it. That partial return is not for them a gift, it is a disruption. Albus Dumbledore, who found the Resurrection Stone in the ring that had belonged to the Gaunt family, put it on despite having had the ring identified as a Horcrux. He put it on because in that moment, for all his wisdom, he was still a man who had spent decades carrying the weight of his sister's death, and the possibility of seeing her, of speaking to her, of perhaps being forgiven, overwhelmed his judgment. The curse in the ring nearly killed him. It would have, had Snape not contained it within his hand. But it did kill him, slowly, over the course of the following year, spreading through his body despite Snape's best efforts. And yet Dumbledore, even dying, found a use for the stone that was neither selfish nor desperate. He hid it in the golden snitch that he left to Harry Potter in his will, with instructions delivered not through words but through the logic of the gift. Harry would need it in the end to face what was coming. He would need to see the dead one last time before walking toward his own death. In the Forbidden Forest, on the night he went to die, Harry opened the snitch and turned the stone 3 times in his palm. And there they were, his mother, his father, his godfather, his old teacher. Not ghosts, not quite whole, but there. And they walked with him out of the forest and to the edge of what he had to do. The most underestimated of the 3 Deathly Hallows, in most popular accounts, is also the most ancient and the most continuously preserved. The cloak of invisibility that came to Harry Potter through his father was not a recent acquisition. It was, according to the most careful historical analysis, the original cloak described in the tale of the 3 brothers, preserved across 700 years of the Potter and Peveril family lines. True cloaks of invisibility are not unusual in the wizarding world. A skilled witch or wizard can produce a reasonable invisibility effect through various spells and enchantments. Enchanted cloaks that render their wearers invisible can be purchased at considerable expense from specialist magical suppliers, but these ordinary cloaks have limitations. Their spells weaken over time, they can be penetrated by specific counterspells. They cannot hide the wearer from every form of magical detection. The original cloak is different. It is not enchanted. The invisibility it confers is part of its very material, as inseparable from the fabric as the silvery shimmer that has characterized it since its creation. It does not fade. Counterspells do not affect it. It conceals even from magical detection methods that would penetrate any ordinary invisibility spell, and it is large enough to conceal multiple people, a property that proves crucial at several points in the history of its most famous wearer. The philosophical significance of the cloak within the structure of the Hallows tale is this. The first 2 Hallows are about fighting death. The Elder Wand gives power enough to defeat any enemy, presumably including death itself. The Resurrection Stone reaches across the boundary of death and brings something back. Both are forms of defiance. The cloak does not defy death, it hides from it. And the wisdom of the 3rd brother, the wisdom that the tale endorses, is not the wisdom of the person who fights the hardest or the loudest. It is the wisdom of the person who understands when to be humble, who understands that some things cannot be fought or overcome, only survived, only endured, only eventually accepted. The 3rd brother did not think himself greater than death. He did not challenge it. He did not try to bring the dead back. He simply lived his life, fully and quietly, until it was time to go. There is something in this, something that applies far beyond the specific context of magical objects and ancient legends that is worth holding on to as we breathe slowly in the quiet of the night. The greatest power is not always the most obvious kind. Sometimes the greatest power is the power to accept, to continue, to pass something on to the next generation and depart with grace. We have arrived at the chapter in the history of magic that requires the least retelling, for it is the most recent and the most widely known. But it deserves its place in this account because what happened on the 2nd of May, 1998, in the halls of Hogwarts was not merely the defeat of a dark wizard. It was the resolution, however partial, of several thousand years of unresolved questions about what magic is, what it should be used for, and what ultimately it cannot do. Voldemort had built his campaign of terror on a specific vision of the magical world, one in which power was everything, in which magical blood determined worth, in which death was the enemy to be conquered above all else. He had pursued this vision with extraordinary intelligence and ruthlessness for decades. He had built a system of terror so comprehensive that, by the time of the Battle of Hogwarts, he controlled not only the wizarding world of Britain but much of the non-magical world through proxies and covert influence. Harry Potter, a 17-year-old boy, walked out of the forest to face him. Not with a plan to duel and win, not with a more powerful weapon, not with an army, but with the understanding, painstakingly acquired across 7 years and 7 pieces of a fractured soul, that there was only one way to end what Voldemort had set in motion, to accept his own death willingly. The magical protection that Lily Potter had created when she died to save her infant son was one of the most profound magical events in modern wizarding history. It was a form of love magic, the oldest and least fully understood branch of magic in the entire tradition. By choosing to die rather than step aside, by offering her life voluntarily in the place of her child's, Lily created a protection rooted in sacrifice that Voldemort, who had never understood love and never been capable of it, could not counter with any spell he knew. That protection lived in Harry's blood. It transferred when Voldemort used Harry's blood to recreate his body in 1995 into Voldemort himself, anchoring Harry to the living world through the very body of his greatest enemy. And it transferred outward, in the final moments of the Battle of Hogwarts, into every person Harry had stated his intention to protect. When Voldemort tried to cast killing curses at the defenders of Hogwarts, they rebounded, because the same love-rooted protection that had saved Harry as an infant was now extended to everyone he had chosen to fight for. The magical theory of what happened that night is still not fully understood. The interaction between the Horcrux in Harry's scar, the Hallows, the protection in his blood, and the love magic of his mother's sacrifice created a situation that had never been created before, and may never be created again. What can be said is that Voldemort's killing curse, cast with the Elder Wand that did not truly belong to him, struck the piece of Voldemort's own soul that was living in Harry's scar. It destroyed that piece of soul without destroying Harry, and Voldemort, with his soul more fragmented than ever, diminished further, was killed by the rebounding spell of his own wand when it turned against him. He died not dramatically, not in a blaze of power. He died small and diminished, and without the grandeur he had always imagined for himself. He died the death of something that had given up too much of itself in the pursuit of power, to have anything left when the power was gone. The castle stood, the dead were mourned, and the wizarding world, battered and scarred, began to rebuild. We have come a long way since the first chapter of this story, from a world before wands and spells, before the first ritual fire was lit and the first incantation spoken into the dark. We have travelled through ancient Egypt and medieval Britain, through the founding of Hogwarts and the fracture of its first community, through the development of potions and divination, and the terrible knowledge of the dark arts, through Grindelwald and Voldemort and the long struggle to define what magic is for, and now we arrive at the world as it is. The wizarding world today, in the early decades of the 21st century, is a world still in process. The international statute of secrecy remains in place, though the debates about its long-term sustainability have grown louder in recent decades. The Ministry of Magic has been reformed several times since the fall of Voldemort, with each reform trying to address the structural problems that allowed the ministry to be infiltrated and corrupted. The relationships between wizarding humans and the other magical peoples, the goblins, the centaurs, the merpeople, the giants, are complex and imperfect, but the conversations have grown more open in recent years than they were in the century before. Hogwarts continues to stand on its windswept Scottish hilltop, accepting students from magical families of every background, teaching them to channel the extraordinary power they carry, and sending them out into a world that needs what they can offer. The four houses remain, each carrying forward the values of its founder. The tension between those values, the courage and the cunning, the wisdom and the welcome, is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. The founders, whatever their conflicts, understood that a complete magical education required all four approaches to the world. That courage without wisdom is recklessness. That cunning without loyalty is treachery. That wisdom without bravery is timidity. That welcome without discernment is naivety. The best witches and wizards are the ones who learn to hold all four. The history of magic is, at its core, the history of human beings trying to understand a force that lives inside them, that exceeds them, that sometimes frightens them, and that, when channeled with intention and care and something like love, produces extraordinary things. Every spell ever cast, every potion ever brewed, every enchantment ever laid into stone or silver or wood is a record of that effort, that reaching, that attempt to take the wild and make it art. We began tonight in a world before names, before traditions, before the first word of an incantation had ever been spoken into the dark, and we have arrived at a world that has been shaped for better and worse and better again by 10,000 years of people trying to learn how to use what they were given. The effort continues. It will always continue. Because the thing about magic, the thing that every wizard and witch who has ever lived has discovered sooner or later, is that there is always more to learn. The subject is inexhaustible. The world it opens onto has no far wall, and that is, in the end, the most wonderful thing about it. Let your breath settle now. Let the long story of tonight settle with it, layer by layer, into the quiet places of your mind. The ancient practitioners with their clay tablets, the four founders in the hills of Scotland, the long dark century of witch trials and the retreat into secrecy, the summer friendship that became a lifelong shadow, the boy in the cupboard under the stairs who turned out to be the end of a very old story and the beginning of a new one. Let it all rest there, in the warm dark behind your closed eyes. The history of magic is a long story, but you have heard it now. And the world it describes, extraordinary, complicated, beautiful, imperfect, reaching always towards something better, is the world you carry with you into sleep. Rest now, you are safe, the story is told, and the magic, as it always has been and always will be, is still here.